Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so today's screencast is going to focus on really kind of the build up to the War of 1812. And so the War of 1812 spans really kind of two presidents, I guess, if you count the causes. So during the Jefferson administration, a lot of the causes of the War of 1812 start to begin. And then the war itself is fought under James Madison, who was Jefferson's Secretary of State. So what we're going to talk about first is kind of some of the main, so we're really focusing on Jefferson's foreign policy, and some of these, like I said, some of these things are causes of the War of 1812. So we're going to first start with some of the historical context, and we're going to look at what's going on in Europe and how does that carry over into North America and, and have an influence on our foreign policy. So first thing we're going to take a look at is what's going on between Napoleon in France and Britain and kind of the rest of European society. So one of the things that we talked about when we discussed the Washington administration is that really the French Revolution dominates American foreign policy during the era, and we have to kind of contend with these wars happening between France and a lot of the other European powers. In the beginning, during the Washington administration, it's a lot of the other European powers like Britain and Austria and Spain trying to stamp out the French Revolution, stop it from spreading. Now, this war kind of morphs a little bit in the Jefferson administration. So Napoleon gains power over France, and he is more or less, a military dictator over, the French Empire. And Napoleon wants to wage wars of aggression against the rest of European society. He has dreams of conquering all of Europe. So as this political cartoon kind of implies, the British and the French are almost kind of carving up the world, and Napoleon wants to cut out Europe for the French Empire. Now, the rest of Europe is not happy about this. Napoleon wants to extend the ideals of the French Revolution through warfare. So the rest of Europe basically forms a coalition against Napoleon. So that's Britain, that's Austria, that's Spain, Portugal, Russia. Basically, the rest of European society tries to stop Napoleon from conquering all of Europe. Now, Napoleon, being the great military tactician that he is, he's able to conquer, pretty substantial pieces of land. So if you look at the Napoleonic Empire here, at this point, by about 1810, Napoleon's empire has he's conquered most of continental Europe. The only countries left standing, prominent countries left standing, are Great Britain and Russia. So he's kind of conquered this huge empire, and so what we have to figure out is how does America fit into this conflict that's taking place between Napoleon and European society. So these are called the Napoleonic Wars. So if you remember, when Napoleon, as we talked about in class today, when Napoleon sells Louisiana to the United States, one of the comments that he makes is that he kind of believes that he's created a rival for England that will eventually surpass England. So it shows you the depth of the dislike and the hatred that the French and Napoleon have for the British. And it really is a battle over dominance within European society. So what we have to figure out is how do we fit into this picture, and where do we what role do we kind of play in this? So there is a carryover between what was going on in Washington and out of the Adams administration into the Jefferson administration. So the thing you want to think about, right? We said the French Revolution dominates what America has to deal with foreign policy-wise. Kind of going a little bit more in depth, one of the major issues that we're dealing with will be what we would call freedom of the seas issues and what's called maritime rights. Two things which to modern Americans don't play a major role in your thinking and kind of what you would think about with foreign policy, but I'm going to repeat that. It's freedom of the seas issues, and going along with that is your maritime rights. What Americans are very concerned about during the Jefferson administration, and that's from the Adams administration and also from the Washington administration, we're dealing with a lot of infringement upon our free trade rights along the oceans. So first it was the French and the British stopping us during the Washington administration. Then it's primarily the French doing it under the Adams administration. During the Jefferson administration, it's going to be the British who are kind of engaging in this harassment of us on the ocean. So when you look at one of the primary things that's going on and that Jefferson has to contend with is that as the war rages between Napoleon and Europe, and primarily Britain is his major adversary in Europe, neither side wants us to trade with the opposition. So America, we try to declare our neutrality in the conflict. We don't want to get involved. But again, we follow both components of Washington's advice, right? We remain neutral, but we continue to trade with both sides. Now, according to international law, there's nothing wrong with that. When you declare neutrality, you're allowed to be economically involved with the combatants. You're allowed to trade with both sides. But that doesn't mean the other sides are going to be happy about that. So the British and the French, neither side likes that. And so the British are going to be the most egregious in trying to stop America from doing this. The British have an extensive navy. And so what they start to do, really two major things. So again, these are infringements upon our maritime rights. What they're doing is they're going to stop our vessels, try and check cargo, confiscate cargo, stop us from trading with who we want to trade with. And it limits our free navigation of the seas. Now, one of the things that they're kind of increasingly doing, which is really getting a lot of negative press in America and causing tension back home and kind of calls for, in certain cases, war with the British, is they're doing something called impressment of American sailors. So impressment means that the British are actually going on to American ships and essentially kidnapping sailors and impressing them, which means pressing them into service, forcing them into the British military. Now, what is behind this? What the British were saying is that the sailors were deserting the British Navy, and they're deserting the British Navy, and what they were doing was they were joining like American commercial vessels, like the crew of American commercial vessels that were trading, back and forth along the Atlantic Ocean. And so they were just kind of taking back their sailors, which could be true in certain cases, that they're kind of impressing sailors back into the British Navy, but they're also taking Americans, mistakenly taking Americans or on purpose taking Americans to kind of fill their ranks. And so this causes a diplomatic problem, and it causes an uproar back in America that this kind of thing is occurring within the United States. So you start to hear like more calls for war within America. Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is political parties back home. What political party is Jefferson? What political party do you think will be calling for war against the British? It's a very complicated thing. Which part of the country will be most affected by this? So remember, Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. If you look back historically, the Federalist Party was against the French Revolution. They have closer ties to the British. The Democratic Republican Party has closer ties to the French Revolution. They wanted us to get involved in the French Revolution, a dislike for the British, more of a dislike for the British, I guess, than the Federalists. And then economically, the Federalists are closely linked to the British through trading. So when you look at the analysis of this, it's kind of interesting. The part of the country that's most affected by this, by impressment, by maritime rights, is going to be New England, because New England engages in trading the most, especially with the British. Now, what we're going to find in today's screencast, and we're going to talk about this more when we come back on Wednesday, is that it's more the Democratic Republicans who are calling for war, even though they're less affected by these maritime infringements and by impressment than the Federalists. So you have to, again, question why. Why would they be calling for war more? And we're going to kind of address that, I think, more in our lesson when we come back than today's lesson. Now, Jefferson tries to deal with this by not going to war. He wants war as a last step. Okay, so he's going to pass a series of different acts. So this is a famous cartoon about one of his acts that he passed. So his act is called the Embargo Act. So you definitely want to know the Embargo Act. So the Embargo Act of 1807. So Jefferson's philosophy here and his approach when he passed the Embargo Act. First, let's get exactly what the Embargo Act was. The Embargo Act of 1807 was a law that prohibited American merchants, from selling and buying products, mostly from selling, but also from buying products, with all of Europe. So it's not just restricting them from selling and buying with the British and the French. It's restricting them, from buying So essentially what the Embargo Act was a restriction on trade between Europe, including Britain, and America. And so Jefferson here, he's trying to basically put economic sanctions on the British and the French and the rest of the Europeans to try and limit trade, but trying to get the British to change their policy. So it's a form of economic pressure. So today we would call this economic sanctions, basically limiting them from selling their products, and we're going to stop selling our products to them, and in a way to try and force them to change their political, and in this case, their policies towards impressment. So it's a very interesting act. It causes a huge uproar in the United States. So the intention here is to get the British to change their policy. Now, Jefferson thinks that the British are reliant, that they need American, mostly agricultural products, like food products and grains in order to survive, and that's going to basically force them to change their policy. He also kind of believes that they need American cotton that's being grown. What they don't kind of take into account is that the British have a huge empire, and that they could use India, they could use some of their other colonies to kind of give them some of their resources. So it's an economic attempt to influence the foreign policy and the actions of the British. Now, the unintended effect of this is that it has major ramifications back home. There is an uproar about it back home. There's a lot of people who are angry about the Embargo Act. And so this cartoon kind of reflects that. So it has more of a negative political effect at home than it has for the positive effect that it was intended to have towards the British and kind of getting them to change their policies within dealing with the United States on the ocean and kind of their maritime restrictions. So it really has more of an effect and a negative effect on politics, domestic politics. So one of the things I'm going to ask you guys to do for your assignment is to analyze this famous political cartoon. It's an interesting cartoon, and it's about the Embargo Act, and it kind of shows some of the anger that Americans were feeling about the Embargo Act, back home. Now, eventually the Embargo Act is repealed by Congress, and they're going to replace it with a later act called the Non-Intercourse Act. And the Non-Intercourse Act is more specific just to the British and the French and kind of restricting trade between American merchants and the British and the French, but not all of European society. So it still leaves us markets that we could trade with in Europe. So it's a less restrictive act, and so it's more of a pinpointed act to try and get the British and the French to change their policy. So these are important for several reasons. So one, it's important because it shows that Jefferson and the Jefferson administration are reluctant to go to war. If they were hot-headed and they were kind of listening to this group of people in Congress called the War Hawks, they would have been pushing for war and have gone to war maybe in 1808 or 1809 when these things started to happen. But they're going to try economic approaches to it, and they're going to try and stay out of this European conflict. So it shows the Washington influence on the Adams administration when we talked about the XYZ affair and kind of the reluctance to go to war, and then the Jefferson administration as well. Now, eventually we are going to go to war with the British, but it's not during the Jefferson administration. It's during the following administration, James Madison. And that's called the War of 1812. So we're going to get into that when we come back to class and talk about the causes. Impressment and infringement of maritime rights is one of the reasons that we go to war with the British, but it's not the only reason. Okay, so we'll analyze that when we come back to class. Make sure you complete the assignment, and I will see you guys when we return back to school.